Hello everybody, my name is Robyn. I'm an artist and filmmaker. So I spent much of my 33rd year considering meta-narratives. I considered the Judeo-Christian sense of the world, and I considered our commercialised sense of the stories we live our lives by. And to a great extent, I thought to myself as a secular Jew that Jesus had died at the age of 33, and I considered what I was contributing to the world. So I did a fair amount of navel gazing in that time, trying to place what it was I was doing, where I was situated, how the world mapped. And then I got the phone call that I would have dreaded receiving, which was the phone call to tell me that my mother had died. So in that very second, in that time slice, my life shunted to a new space. I, without knowing it, was placed at the point of a rite of passage. So this photograph was taken 12 days before my mother's death. And I was shunted to a place of business transactions. That's what tends to happen. And the business of death considers the post-mortem, the acquisition of death certificates. I had to prove I was my mother's daughter at the bank, so there was no point of saying, but that's my mum. I had to go, here are my 3 documents to say that's my mother, can we close her account? There was the house clearance, and of course there was a funeral. And during that time, it seemed to me that little else marked the experience of passing. Nothing showed me a way to go. Nothing embodied my relationship and that reciprocity that I'd shared with that woman. None of it did. None of the paperwork, none of the going to the bank. The funeral didn't. The funeral was one day. I had some friends that came closer, but in exactly the same way, I had other friends that disappeared into the ether at the mere thought of it. It was at this point that I began to understand that I was experiencing, as a rite of passage, a really potent and powerful time, and that related to embodied knowledge. So whilst I was looking outside of myself for a direction and a map, none of those were occurring. So embodied knowledge is the practice of the accumulated body within our social and cultural environment. And what I chose to do in that space was turn the camera on myself, because there were no ways out of this map. I couldn't understand where she'd gone, I didn't understand where the essence of her was, and I couldn't really understand where I was in relationship to it. So this photograph is taken in the house that I lived in with my mother, and it's 24 hours before I put the keys back through the door and can never enter it again physically. So it's 24 hours before I have to say goodbye to everything that has formed my sense of the world, all of those metaphors, all of that growing up, that I have to put the key through the door and never open it again because somebody else is buying it. So my instincts in that time told me, as a practitioner, that my only safe route through this experience, because of how overwhelming I found it, would mean that I was going to have to cross the line in terms of expected behaviours. I was going to basically turn that camera on myself so that I could see what it was I was actually processing. I was going to turn that camera on the space that I lived in. I was going to try and understand where all these vacant spaces were, whether they were within myself or whether they were in a collective sense of what motherhood means, of what being a daughter means, of what mortality means. I basically photographed light on walls, empty stairways, all of the manifestations of what felt hollow as a vessel. So the process began with the home, and in many ways I began to understand the cultural presumptions that collapsed in the face of my mother's death. So all of those expectations of the fact that I thought she would see me get married, that I thought that she would see me carry children, that I thought that she would tell me all of those things about what that meant to be and how I would be as a person in the world, evaporated with the phone call. And this is something that is going to happen to every last one of us. And yet there was no map to tell me what to do or how to be. Taken away in one phone call. So the reality of this experience draws me now to conclude that life unfolds at the rate it will unfold. And you may have your children, and your mother may live until she's 100, and you may understand all of that knowledge. But also it started to teach me about taboo. And it started to teach me about the things I'm not supposed to talk about public, or are you? Are you supposed to turn over those lines? Are you supposed to step into that space? So as this quote testifies, the first glimpse of something taboo teaches us more about ourselves than exactly about what is being looked at. So it seems to me that we are reluctant to accept our more vulnerable emotions, to talk publicly about how valid those emotions are, that it's valid for me to show you a painful slide like that. It's valid for me to talk to you about that sense of severance, the severance anxiety. And to me, it's within this context that I renegotiate my experience of vulnerability and my relationship to death. So as a practitioner, when I place work in that public space, I'm asking something of all of you. I'm asking something of your relationships with the people that you love, with the people that you're sat next to, with your presumptions about what you think may happen in the order that it's going to happen. Because all we actually have is this moment right now. So my journey with the research, 9 months on from her death, took me to doing a practice-based research master's in Manchester. And as part of the process, the structure of a research master's meant that I designed for myself a research question where I looked at the personal and the social and the intimate for me, and the collective, and our wider representations of death, and what that means to us collectively when we behave. And this is a photograph from a research trip, and it's a photograph from a concentration camp. It's the entrance to Mauthausen, which is in Linz in Austria. And my journey had taught me to turn the camera on myself if I wanted to understand what it was I was looking at, to look at my emotions, to see what was happening in my cognitive unconscious. And that was my journey through that. That was the narrative to share. That was where my answer would be found. And within that cognitive unconscious space, I entered this entrance courtyard, knowing that most people that would have entered that space weren't ever going to leave that space, that those gates would be closed. And exactly as I had done at home instinctively in that space, I turned the camera on myself. So I systematically took 50 photographs at head height of the spaces that I looked at and my face, so that I could begin to divinate this relationship between what I was feeling before my head's kicked in, before my assumptions and presumptions about the order of life, or what it was I thought I was thinking. I wanted to look underneath that, and I wanted to communicate something underneath that to the people that were receiving my work. So I became what's known as an indweller, and to a certain extent we're all indwellers, but I specifically and consciously chose to become an indweller. Now, Moustakis describes indwelling as a willingness to gaze with unwavering attention and concentration on some facet of human experience in order to understand its constituent qualities and its wholeness. The indwelling process is conscious and deliberate, yet it's not lineal and it's not logical. It follows clues wherever they appear, and one dwells inside and expands their meanings and associations until a fundamental insight is achieved. So when I look at an image like this, and you see the image that you have seen before this, which is my face looking at this corridor, this is the medical ward of a concentration camp. So realistically, what that means when we unpack death and our social space of death is this is the ward where experiments were performed. This is where chemicals were tested. This is where bodies were annihilated. People on a mass scale were lab rats. And when you see the image you saw before, that's how that rests in my body, and that's how you receive that. So as I've said, in a way, both sets of images of my face are generated beyond the point of conscious deconstruction. The actions are not premeditated when I take those images, but they are driven by an innate history, which is linked to the earth. And Joseph Beuys talked of a location's field character, the resonance that an earth and a history communicates to you as a person. Your understanding, your divination of that space. So if we take a moment to read this quote, grief is our way of letting go. And whatever we do not let go of, we hold on to forever. Traditional communities knew this and made the open sharing of their grief a living part of their ceremonial life. But this is rarely seen in industrial societies. So whatever we do not let go of, we hold on to for the rest of our lives. In the way we communicate, in the way we connect, in the way we talk to each other, in the way we play out our stories. So on a primal level, it's these stories and ceremonies related to birth, coming of age, marriage, death, that are the narratives that are actually ours. They're rightly ours. We own those narratives. They emerge out of our coexistence. That's what happens when I spend time with people and I want to get closer and I marry someone and I have children. That's what happens. Those are our stories. But those stories are not based on profit margins. They're not based on neoliberal constructs that means that we need to make more and we need to make it now. They're based on how we connect with each other. And the end of the spectrum where we talk about death is not commonly talked about any longer. It's not represented socially in the way we used to represent it. We feel like something has been omitted from the body if we cry. And then when we cry, we apologise and we say, oh, I'm sorry, I got a bit upset. It was because of this or that or the other. Instead of holding the space for one another. Because, of course, we cry. We laugh. We commune. We cry. We eventually die. So the mainstay of my work for the last 3 years has involved these spaces where we memorialise life, but it's also involved opening up those spaces and talking about the connectivity of those spaces and showing those spaces in alternative ways and understanding the place and context of death. So the images that you see here are photographs of a natural burial ground. And instead of gravestones to mark the mounds, it's a very developed graveyard. It's been there for a long time. So the plants and the ecosystem are growing. They're growing with the bodies. The bodies are being nurtured by the earth, and the earth is nurturing the bodies. And instead of a gravestone, the families put a bird box up into the trees. So they openly invite life instead of a standardised piece of stone. And this is a piece of work that I created in an Orthodox Jewish graveyard in Kensington. It's 124 temporary lights because I was confronted by a space of traditional, standardised, orthodox patterns of being and ways of being. They're stones that stand upright and tall. And for one night, I filled the graveyard with light. And I watched children come into that graveyard who had never been to that space, and their eyes lit as if they were looking at orbs. They weren't thinking of death. They weren't thinking of dead bodies. They were thinking of the light situated in the context of death. They were thinking of a connection to what's growing in the space of what has essentially died. So really, in conclusion, my overarching understanding of death is that when it originally hit, although I had no markers to guide me through that process, although I understood that it was something immediate and a rite of passage that I was experiencing, it was my connection to the earth and my ability to cross over the line of vulnerability that showed me the way to go. And we come back into this sense of rite of passage. We are inextricably linked to it as a rite of passage. So a rite of passage is something that happens to an individual and as such is particularly intense. It's a personal experience, but it is at the same time social and, in most cases, institutional. So to conclude, what I want to leave you with is this sense that evolving communities tell stories about their stories across the entire spectrum. If we aren't sharing dialogues about our connection to one another and the cycles of Earth, then we're not communicating on a profound level about who it is we actually are. I mean, to put that another way, if we don't share stories about our death, then we won't actually grow as a society. If we don't open up to those narratives that are the narratives that are truly ours, then we'll remain within a system that is dominated by profit as opposed to value. Thank you.